The smell of charred meat filled the air as the family gathered around the patio table, laughter and chatter mixing with the sizzle of the grill. It was supposed to be a pleasant evening, a chance to unwind and enjoy each other's company. Little did I know that my world was about to be turned upside down. "Bryn, dear, we've been talking," Glenn began, his tone already setting off alarm bells in my mind. "And we think it's time for my parents to move in with us." I blinked, certain I must have misheard him. "Wait, what? You're saying they'll be living with us?" Marlon and Esther exchanged a smug look, as if they'd already won some unspoken battle. "It's for the best, honey," Glenn continued, oblivious to my mounting disbelief. "They're getting older, and we can't expect them to keep up with their big house all on their own." Esther chimed in, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We don't want to be a burden, but you know how it is at our age. We'll need some help around the house." I stared at Glenn, searching his face for any sign that he understood the implications of what he was proposing. "And you decided this without consulting me first?" I asked, my voice trembling with barely contained anger. "It's settled, then. My parents are moving in next week. It's what's best for everyone, right?" Glenn said, his tone leaving no room for argument. As the others continued chatting and laughing, I sat in stunned silence, the weight of Glenn's words sinking in. In one fell swoop, he had upended our lives, our home, without so much as a discussion, and from the gleam in Marlon and Esther's eyes, I knew this was only the beginning. True to Glenn's word, Marlon and Esther arrived a week later, suitcases in hand and smug grins plastered across their faces. I plastered on a polite smile, determined not to let them see how their presence was already suffocating me. "Welcome to our home," I said, forcing the words out through gritted teeth. Esther surveyed the living room, her nose wrinkling in distaste. "Oh, these curtains have to go. And dear, maybe take a cooking class or two." I bristled at her condescending tone, but before I could respond, Glenn stepped in. Now, let's not start anything on the first day." Marlon chuckled, a deep, grating sound that set my nerves on edge. "Don't worry, son. We're just getting settled in. Plenty of time to make some changes around here." Over the next few days, it became abundantly clear that some changes was a gross understatement. Esther took it upon herself to redecorate, tossing out my carefully curated decor and replacing it with gaudy, outdated pieces she claimed were classic. In the kitchen, she ruled with an iron fist, criticizing my every move and insisting on improving my recipes with her own additions. More often than not, these so-called improvements resulted in inedible disasters. Through it all, Glenn remained infuriatingly passive, seemingly content to let his parents run roughshod over our home and our lives. Whenever I tried to voice my concerns, he would simply shrug and mutter something about respecting his elders. One evening, as I was cleaning up after another disastrous dinner, Esther cornered me in the kitchen. "You know, dear, it might be best if you just let me handle the cooking from now on," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "Wouldn't want to keep disappointing Glenn, now would we?" I opened my mouth to protest, but she held up a hand, cutting me off. "Don't worry, I'll make sure you're taken care of. You just focus on keeping the house tidy." As she swept out of the kitchen, I felt a surge of anger and humiliation. This was my home, my domain, and she was treating me like a servant in my own house. That night, as I lay awake next to Glenn's softly snoring form, I vowed that this would not stand. I would not be relegated to the role of a glorified maid in my own life. Something had to change, and soon, before Marlon and Esther's grip on our lives became unbreakable. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as we all gathered around the dining table for our weekly family dinner. Marlon sat at the head of the table, as if he were the lord of the manor, while Esther fussed over the meal she had prepared. "I hope everyone's hungry," she announced, setting down a plate of what looked like overcooked meatballs swimming in a questionable gravy. "It's an old family recipe." I eyed the dish warily, already regretting agreeing to these forced family meals. Esther had been slowly but surely pushing me out of the kitchen, and it was starting to feel like a deliberate power play. Glenn, ever the peacekeeper, forced a smile. "It looks delicious, Mom. Thank you for cooking." Marlon grunted in agreement, already digging in with gusto. I picked at the food, trying to mask my distaste. As the meal progressed, Marlon began to hold court, regaling us with tales of his glory days and the traditions he expected to be upheld in this household. "In my house, we respect traditions. You do well to remember that, Bryn," he said, fixing me with a stern glare. I bristled at his condescending tone, but before I could respond, Esther chimed in. "Yes, dear. We wouldn't want you to forget your place," she simpered, her words laced with venom. Glenn shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but remained silent. As usual, he was unwilling to stand up to his parents, even when they were openly disrespecting his wife. The meal dragged on, with Marlon and Esther taking turns criticizing everything from my cooking to my choice of decor. With each cutting remark, I felt my anger simmering closer to a boil. Finally, when Marlon made a snide comment about my lack of domestic skills, I'd had enough. "That's it," I snapped, slamming my fork down on the table. "I've had it with your constant belittling and disrespect in my own home." Marlon's eyes widened in surprise, unused to being challenged. "Watch your tone, young lady," he warned, but I was past caring about his empty threats. "No, you watch your tone," I shot back. "This is my house, and I won't be treated like a second-class citizen in it." Esther opened her mouth, no doubt to spew more vitriol, but I held up a hand to silence her. "Save it," I said, pushing my chair back from the table. "I'm done being the punching bag for your twisted power games. If you can't show me basic respect, then I want you out of my home." With that, I turned on my heel and stormed out, leaving them sputtering in my wake. As I retreated to the bedroom, I could hear Glenn's feeble attempts to smooth things over, but for once, I didn't care. I was done being the doormat. The soft murmur of voices drifted down the hallway, pulling me from my restless slumber. Glancing at the clock, I realized it was well past midnight, and Glenn was still nowhere to be found. Curiosity piqued. I slipped out of bed and crept towards the sound. As I neared the living room, the voices became clearer, unmistakably belonging to Marlon and Esther. I paused, hand on the doorframe, as their hushed tones took on a sinister edge. "Once she's gone, we'll have free rein. Glenn will follow our lead. He always does." Esther was whispering, her voice laced with smug confidence. My heart dropped into my stomach as the implication of her words sank in. They were plotting to get rid of me, to take complete control of my home and my husband. Marlon grunted in agreement. "The boy's too soft to stand up to us. We'll just have to keep pushing until she cracks." White-hot fury coursed through my veins, momentarily drowning out the sickening sense of betrayal. How dare they scheme behind my back, hatching plans to uproot my life, as if I were some inconvenient obstacle? Without thinking, I fumbled for my phone and hit the record button, determined to capture their vile machinations for proof. Their voices continued, each word like a dagger twisting in my gut. "It's only a matter of time before she leaves on her own," Esther cackled. "Then this house will be ours, just like it should have been from the start." I'd heard enough. Clutching the damning recording, I stormed back to the bedroom, my mind racing. Part of me wanted nothing more than to confront them head-on, to hurl their treachery back in their smug faces. But a smaller, more rational voice urged caution. These were not people who played by the rules, and if I tipped my hand too soon, they might find a way to turn the situation to their advantage. No, I needed to bide my time, to gather my strength and plan my counterattack. Because one thing was certain, I would not be driven from my own home by these vipers, no matter how cunning their schemes. As the first rays of dawn crept through the window, I found myself wide awake, a steely resolve settling over me. The gauntlet had been thrown, and I had no choice but to meet it head-on. This was war, and I would emerge victorious, no matter the cost. The tension in the house was palpable, a thick miasma of resentment and hostility that hung in the air like a noxious cloud. Marlon and Esther had been shooting me venomous glares ever since my outburst at the disastrous family dinner, no doubt sensing that the balance of power had shifted. For my part, I refused to cower or back down. Armed with the damning recording of their treacherous plot, I was finally ready to confront them head-on and lay down the law. "Glenn, we need to have a family meeting," I announced one evening, my tone brooking no argument. "There are some things we need to discuss." He opened his mouth, no doubt to protest, but one stern look from me had him snapping it shut. Reluctantly, he gathered Marlon and Esther in the living room, their expressions a mixture of confusion and thinly veiled contempt. I wasted no time beating around the bush. With a few taps on my phone, the incriminating recording began to play, their own poisonous words filling the tense silence. Marlon's face purpled with rage as the implications sank in, while Esther's mouth worked soundlessly, struggling to formulate a defense. Glenn, for his part, looked utterly blindsided, as if the world he knew had been turned upside down. "So," I said, fixing them with a steely glare once the recording had finished. "Care to explain yourselves?" Esther was the first to find her voice, her tone sickly sweet in a way that sent shivers down my spine. "Now, Bryn, dear, surely you don't believe?" "Save it," I snapped, cutting her off. "I have the proof right here. You two have been plotting against me from the start, scheming to take over my home and manipulate Glenn to your whims." Marlon slammed his fist on the coffee table, causing Glenn to flinch. "How dare you accuse us of such things?" he bellowed, his face contorted with fury. "We're family, damn it!" I met his rage with icy calm, refusing to be cowed. Family doesn't plot to undermine and displace one another. Family doesn't treat each other with such blatant disrespect and contempt. Turning to Glenn, I fixed him with an unwavering stare. "You have a choice to make. Either you stand with me, your wife, or you side with these manipulative vipers who clearly have no qualms about destroying our marriage for their own gain." Glenn squirmed under the weight of my gaze, visibly struggling with the ultimatum I had presented. For a brief, heart-wrenching moment, I thought he might actually choose his parents over me. But then something shifted in his expression, a glimmer of resolve flickering to life. "Bryn's right," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This has gone too far. You two need to leave before you do any more damage to this family." Marlon and Esther's expressions morphed into masks of outraged disbelief, but I felt a surge of vindication coursing through me. Finally, after months of torment and manipulation, the tide had turned. "I won't be plotted against in my own home," I stated, fixing them with an unwavering stare. "Glenn, it's them or me. Make your choice." The deafening silence that followed my ultimatum seemed to stretch into eternity. I watched Glenn's face, searching for any sign of the resolve I had seen flicker to life moments earlier. But as the seconds ticked by, that glimmer of hope began to fade. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're my parents, Bryn. What do you expect me to do?" The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind from my lungs. After everything, the manipulation, the lies, the blatant disrespect, he was still choosing them over me. Marlon and Esther exchanged a triumphant look, their smug expressions twisting the knife even deeper. "You heard the boy," Marlon sneered. "We're not going anywhere." Rage and humiliation burned through me like wildfire, threatening to consume me from the inside out. How could Glenn be so blind, so utterly cowed by these toxic people? "Fine," I bit out, struggling to keep my voice steady. "If that's how it's going to be, then I want you all out of my house within the week." Esther let out a derisive cackle. "Your house? Don't you mean Glenn's house?" "No, Esther. My house." I fixed her with a steely glare. "The deed is in my name, and I'll be damned if I let you two vultures pick over what's rightfully mine." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her features, but Marlon remained undeterred. "You'll regret this," he growled, jabbing a gnarled finger in my direction. "We're not going anywhere." "We'll see about that," I shot back, already formulating a plan. Over the next few days, I moved through the house like a woman possessed, making phone calls and gathering documents with single-minded determination. While Marlon and Esther swanned about, secure in their perceived victory, I was laying the groundwork for their downfall. First, I reached out to a lawyer, ensuring that every legal avenue was covered and that the house was indeed mine, free and clear. Then, I began methodically securing my finances, opening new accounts and transferring funds to keep them out of reach. By the time the week was up, I was ready to strike. "Family meeting," I announced, my tone leaving no room for argument. They gathered, predictably smug and dismissive, no doubt expecting another round of empty threats and bluster. But the looks on their faces when I slapped the eviction notices on the coffee table were priceless. "What's this?" Marlon blustered, snatching up the papers. "Exactly what it looks like," I replied, my voice calm and even. "You have 30 days to vacate my property. After that, I'll have the authorities remove you." Esther's face turned an alarming shade of puce as the implication sank in. You can't do this. I already have. I turned to Glenn, who had gone pale as a sheet. And as for you, I'll be filing for divorce. I'm done being disrespected and manipulated in my own home. For a moment it looked like he might protest, but one glance at my resolute expression seemed to drain the fight from him. As Marlon and Esther raged and sputtered, hurling impotent threats and insults, I simply watched, unmoved. The battle was won, and they had been the architects of their own undoing. You underestimated me, I stated, letting the words hang in the air. This is my house and my life. I'm taking both back. The look on Marlon and Esther's faces when the lawyer laid out the cold, hard facts was almost worth the turmoil they'd put me through. Almost. As you can see, the lawyer stated, sliding a copy of the deed across the table, Mrs. Bryn is the sole owner of the property. Your eviction notices are completely legal and binding. Esther sputtered indignantly, her face mottled with rage. This has to be some kind of mistake, Glenn, tell them. But Glenn remained silent, his gaze fixed on the tabletop, unable or unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. No mistake, I'm afraid, the lawyer continued, unruffled. Your son's name isn't on the deed, nor are either of yours. Legally, you have no claim to this residence. Marlon slammed his fist on the table, making us all jump. Like hell we don't. We're family, damn it. That has to count for something. I couldn't help but let out a derisive snort. Family? You two have done nothing but disrespect and undermine me from the moment you stepped foot in my home. Speaking of which, I slid a thick manila envelope across the table, letting it come to rest in front of Glenn. Those are the divorce papers. I want you out too, Glenn. I'm done being a doormat. A muscle twitched in Marlon's jaw as he processed my words. You ungrateful little. That's enough, the lawyer interjected, fixing them with a stern look. You have 30 days to vacate the premises, per the eviction notices. I suggest you start making alternative living arrangements. As Marlon and Esther continued to bluster and rage, I calmly gathered my things and stood. I'll be moving my belongings into the guest room for the time being. Don't worry, I'll be out of your hair soon enough. Glenn finally looked up at that, his expression a twisted mask of hurt and confusion. Bryn, please, can't we talk about this? I fixed him with a level stare, unmoved. We've talked enough, Glenn. For years, I begged you to stand up to them, to put our marriage first. But in the end, you chose them over me, every single time. Well, now I'm choosing myself. With that, I turned on my heel and strode out, leaving them to stew in the wreckage of their scheming. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into preparing for my new life. The lawyer helped me secure a restraining order against Marlon and Esther, ensuring they couldn't make any last-ditch attempts at sabotage. I sorted through my finances, relieved to find that they hadn't managed to drain my accounts during their reign of terror. In fact, thanks to some savvy investing on my part over the years, I was in a far better financial position than even I had realized. As the eviction date loomed, I made plans to renovate and redecorate the house to my taste, wiping away any lingering traces of their toxic influence. A symbolic fresh start of sorts. Finally, the day arrived. I watched from the living room window as the moving truck pulled up, Marlon and Esther storming out with their meager belongings in tow. Glenn trailed behind, looking utterly dejected. As they loaded up the truck, I felt a strange sense of hollowness settle over me. A part of me had hoped that Glenn might come to his senses, that he might finally find the strength to stand up to his parents and fight for our marriage. But as he climbed into the passenger seat without so much as a backward glance, I knew it was over. He had made his choice, and I had made mine. Later that evening, as I sipped a glass of wine on the back patio, reveling in the silence and solitude, a profound sense of peace washed over me. The war was won, the battlefield clear. A fresh start awaited, one free from manipulation and toxicity. And this time I vowed no one would take that away from me. The divorce was finalized with a satisfying thud of the judge's gavel. As I gathered my belongings and prepared to leave the courtroom, I caught a glimpse of Glenn across the aisle. His head was bowed, shoulders slumped in defeat, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of sadness. This was the man I had once loved, the man I had vowed to spend my life with. And yet, in the end, his inability to break free from his parents' toxic grip had cost us everything. But that sorrow was quickly overshadowed by a surge of resolve. I was free now, finally untethered from the weight of that dysfunctional family. And as I stepped out into the crisp morning air, I vowed to make the most of my newfound independence. The first order of business was reclaiming my home. As soon as the ink was dry on the divorce papers, I set to work stripping away every last trace of Marlon and Esther's presence. Out went the gaudy decor, the oppressive curtains, and the musty odor that seemed to cling to every surface. In their place, I ushered in a fresh, vibrant energy. Walls were painted in soothing hues, windows flung open to invite in the rejuvenating breeze. Piece by piece, I rebuilt my sanctuary, infusing it with my own personal style and flair. As the renovations progressed, I could feel the weight of the past year sloughing off my shoulders. The house was no longer a battleground, but a canvas upon which I could paint the life I truly desired. With my living space restored, I turned my attention to rebuilding my social circles. Years of Marlon and Esther's manipulation had driven a wedge between me and many of my friends and loved ones. But now, free of their toxic influence, I found those connections slowly rekindling. Dinners with old friends, laughter-filled nights on the town. I drank it all in like a woman emerging from a long drought. Each interaction was a reminder that I was no longer isolated, no longer trapped in the suffocating bubble those two had created. As the months passed, I found myself settling into a newfound rhythm, a life that was wholly and unapologetically my own. Gone were the days of walking on eggshells, of constantly second-guessing myself to appease the whims of others. In their place was a sense of empowerment, a knowledge that I had faced down my demons and emerged victorious. The road had been long and arduous, but I had reclaimed what was rightfully mine: my home, my independence, my very sense of self. On the nights when the loneliness crept in, I would step out onto the back patio and gaze up at the stars, letting their timeless presence soothe me. I had built this life once before, stone by precious stone, and now I would do it again, better and stronger than ever. "I'm not going anywhere," I whispered into the night air, a small, satisfied smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. This was my home, my refuge, and I would guard it fiercely against any who dared try to threaten it again. For the first time in far too long, I felt truly at peace, free to forge my own path without fear or compromise. The future was a blank canvas, and I was the artist, brush in hand, ready to paint a masterpiece.